Hello, this is Jim McKeith, Developer Evangelist for Embarcadero Technologies, and welcome to this Developer Skill Sprint on understanding and using FireMonkey layouts. This skill sprint works across all platforms, all languages. Anywhere using Rad Studio, Delphi, or C++ Builder, you can take advantage of this skill sprint. We're going to talk about how to build one form to rule them all. That's one of the key things that makes FireMonkey and FireUI so powerful, is that you can build one form that looks great on all platforms. We're going to touch on anchors, alignments, and spacing. We're mostly going to focus on layouts, and then we're going to talk about a few other related technologies in FireMonkey. So anchors are what you use to set the way a control resizes and moves around when the form changes. So it moves with the parent when the parent resizes, or resizes if it's two different opposite sides are anchored. So if top and bottom are anchored, then when the form gets taller, the control gets taller. If only top's anchored, then it just stays relative to the top. You've most likely used anchors before. Each control can have from 0 to 4 anchors. Alignment aligns the control with its parent, setting the anchor's size and position. So if you set the alignment, it overrides what you set for anchors. The alignment options have way expanded in FireMonkey compared to VCL. So you can anchor and fill along an edge with top, bottom, left, and right. Or you can fill the parent but preserve aspect ratios with the fit alignments. You have fit, fit left, and fit right. And then you can fill along one side of the parent with most bottom, most top, most left, and most right. So the difference with this one is this is the most to the left. For example, if you have something else to the left, this goes to the left beyond that. And so this gives you some ability to prioritize the alignments. You can only resize on one axis if you want to, with the vertical, vert center, horizontal, and horizontal center. Those are similar to the way client works. So client aligns it to fill the entire thing, horizontal and vertical, whereas these only work on one axis, which is kind of cool. So you also have center, which is going to be centered but not expanded. And then contents, which is kind of interesting. It's like client, except it actually fills all the contents. So if there's something else on the top, for example, client or contents will actually go under that, which is kind of interesting. And then scale will expand it as the parent scales. So a lot of great options here. You really need to experiment with these and get more familiar with them. There's the DocWiki link down at the bottom. So margins and spacings are a great way to add that little bit of space in there that makes your controls, the layout, more aesthetically pleasing, if you will. Margins is the space for the siblings. So if you put margins on a control, that's how much space that control must have between its siblings or between the edge of the control and its parent's edge. Padding, on the other hand, is the spacing for the children of that control. So if you add padding, when you put controls on that control, now all FireMonkey controls can be nested. Any controls you put inside that control once it has padding on it must be or will get spaced that far away from the edges based on the padding. So let's talk about some layouts. The flow layout, the best way I can figure out how to describe this is it's like the words in a paragraph. Okay, so as you resize the container, the controls flow to fill that container in. So this is, I think it's a really slick layout. At times in the past I wanted to do this and had to develop it myself, and so it's great to see something like this in FireMonkey. The one thing though is if you do want to have a forced break, so you see in that picture on the left there, button 6 and button 5 have space after them that could be filled by a button. You do that by putting a T flow layout break in there, and that forces a line break. So it's like a hard carriage return in a paragraph of text. So here we have a T flow layout with a bunch of buttons on it on here. Now, the way this works is as you add new controls, so add a new button here to the flow layout, it gets added to the end of the layout. And then when I resize this, that's how it goes there. So now, if you want to change the order something is, though, you just select the control and you just change its Z order. So we do this, we'll say send it back, and that put that up there on the top. Now I actually want that a little bit narrower. So let's go ahead and shrink this guy down. Boop. And I can tweak it more later. Clearly I need to mess with my alignment here on this one. Let's go ahead and make it twice as big, maybe. Okay. Anyway, you can play with this. This control here with this button with the diagonal text, that's a button with no text and a label on it. The label is parented on the button, and then I've just rotated the text on the button. Just trying to have a little fun with that one there. Let's take this, make it a little smaller. I should have tweaked that a little bit more beforehand. And let's make this taller here so I keep the... Okay. So this is an example actually of something I find that's useful with the flow layout is that I can keep this here always together. I always know this is going to be above it. I always know this is going to be the right of that edit box, no matter how this lays out. So let me run this here. And if I maximize this, which is not very exciting, and then however I resize this, etc., it just flows those all out. Now, also we mentioned that you have the flow break. So it added the flow break right here. Now, if I want to put some more buttons on here, let's see, button. Oh, it puts them on the flow break. Haha. Because the flow break is a layout, and so it gets those added to it. All right, so let's scroll up here and put the one there. Okay, so you see now they are broken there. So there's a gap as I resize this. And so you can use lots of flow breaks there. And the same thing with flow breaks, if you want to change the Z order, you just select the flow break and then use control bring to front, move to back type situation. So there you go. That's the big thing with the flow layout. Very useful if you're going to have controls that you want to just flow into the space, like I said, like text in a paragraph. Grid layout is really useful if you want to have a grid of controls like you see here. So the way grid layout works is you set on the layout the item width and item height, and then all the controls you place on there will have that item width and item height. Now, if you notice the second image down at the bottom, you see some things at different sizes, and that's because those controls have margins specified. So by specifying a margin, then it shrinks it down to fit within the margins. So you see there, the margins are set to fill the rest of that space up. So then as you resize the container, then the way the controls fit in there changes. So now we've got a grid layout down here. Now at first blush, when I resize this, you see it flows like a flow control does. But the difference is the grid layout is I can't resize these individual controls. I can try to, but nothing happens. If you want to change the size of the controls, you come over here and find where it says item height and item width, and you change this. So we can change this to 50 and make this a little smaller, or we can change it to 80 and make them all bigger. Okay, now you notice there's one here that is a different size than the rest of them, and that is done by setting the margins on it. So there's the margins are set on this guy here. So there's the grid layout. It behaves the same way when I run it as at design time when I resize the container that it's in. So when you want to have a lot of controls that are all the same size, grid layout's the way to go. Now it's different than the grid panel layout. The grid panel layout, you create a grid, okay, and then each control you set the width, height, align, and anchors of those controls. And then you can then place those controls in the cells that are created of that grid. Okay, so you don't specify the size of or the location of the controls. You instead specify which cells they belong into, but you then instead specify the sizes. So it's a little more flexible for being able to customize the behavior of the controls than the grid layout. Also, as you see here, the controls can span multiple cells. So let's take a look at the grid panel layout. We'll go ahead and align it to client. Now, the way the grid panel layout works is you notice we have a grid. We have 2 columns and 2 rows, so 4. And here's we have collections here. There's a column collection and a row collection. That's what we're going to look at first. Column collection, row collection. And we'll go ahead and add a new row. Now, right now, the rows are set to percentages, and they're set to each 50. Now, if I add a new row, it's going to set the value to 0 because it always makes sure these add up to be 100. Now, if I want to make this one, if I want to divide it 30% each way, then I have to, I can set it to like 60%. And what's going to happen is I'm going to go through and do some automatic adjustment here. I found if you just set it to 33 a few times, pretty soon it gets pretty close because it keeps auto adjusting that. You can go and modify the other ones or do it different ways. That's what I usually do. Find whatever method works best for you though. So now you notice we have 3 rows and 2 columns. Now when I add a control here, it automatically puts it in the first cell, and add another control, puts it in the second cell, add another control, puts it in the third cell. Now, if we want to move the controls around, there is a collection, control collection. There we go. So here's the 3 buttons I put down here. And I can come to these and I can say, oh, let's take button 3 and let's make it span 2 columns. And now button 3 spans 2 columns. Or I can put it into row 3. Yeah, I can't put it in row 3 because there's not that many rows. Row 2. So 0, 1, 2. So that's how you move the controls around within the grid layout. So that's what all there is to it. Grid layout, you still come in here, you can still set the size of these. So I can say, or I can set it here. Oops, I'm having trouble with my mouse. There we go. Make it bigger. So you can still do all that stuff. You still control the individual controls, but the position is controlled by the grid panel layout. And then the control collection is how you can tweak that. So the scaled layout, at first, I think is not very useful because if you see there, you have this stretched, distorted controls here because these controls are placed in a scaled layout and the scaled layout was stretched and you get this distorted view. That's not very useful. I don't like that distorted. It doesn't look good to me. There might be a situation where you do want that though, so that could be useful. But if you set the align of the scaled layout to fit, it maintains the aspect ratio. And so by doing that, then you can have it stretch and it will grow according to the aspect ratio, which I think is way more useful. So it's important that you, when using these layouts, you get a real good understanding of them so that you can use them in the way you'd expected. Because when I first wanted to use scaled layout, I wanted to maintain aspect ratio and it didn't. But by setting align to fit, it does maintain aspect ratio. So now we've got down a scaled layout. Now, at the design time, it doesn't do anything interesting. It behaves like a regular layout. But at runtime, when I run this, when you resize the scaled layout, so it's set to client right now, it scales the contents. Now, when you notice that if I don't scale this proportionally, we get some kind of odd looking drawing there because it's stretching it out. I don't like the stretching it out. There might be a situation you like the stretching it out. There you go. You can do it that way. But if you change the alignment of it from client to fit, then when you scale it, notice it always maintains the aspect ratio. And so it looks kind of funky. These things still work. Hello. At such a large size, but they do. Now, usually if you're making a user interface that you want to adapt to different screen sizes, scaling up your user interface elements is not the best way to go. You want to create a user interface that adapts dynamically to the different sizes. So you don't want, that's not a very exciting form, that's that huge with such big buttons. There may be situations when you do want to do that though, and it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And so it's great that you have the flexibility to be able to deal with this if that's what you need in that situation. So there you go, that's the scaled layout. Scroll box. I think this is a layout still. It's not called a layout, so maybe you wouldn't call it a layout. But what it does is it allows you to put it in on another control, on another layout, for example, and then it allows the child controls placed in the scroll box to take up more space than the parent does. So it's like turns it into a TARDIS, if you will. It's big on the inside. So you put the scroll box down, and then I usually would align it to client, anchor it to client, so it's filling the entire space of the parent. And then you put new children controls in it, and only align those to the top and left. If you align them otherwise, it gets really funky. At least that's been my experience. You might find something that works differently, but be warned, if you go beyond top and left, it might not behave as expected. And then what happens is the user can scroll to see the additional children. So there's a few variations on the scroll box. The regular scroll box controls both vertically and horizontally, but then we also have the T-vert scroll box, horizontal scroll box, and framed versions of those as well. Tab control is really useful because it allows you to have multiple layouts that overlap each other, and then the user can transition between those using the tab controls. Now you can set the tab position to none, and it hides the navigation, and then you can manually control which tab's visible. And you also have the ability to use animations, which is kind of cool as well. Frames give you the ability to create reusable user interface elements. And these are not just the controls, but actually the code behind the controls. So basically you're creating an entire form, if you will, but then setting it aside and being able to reuse it later. So this is really useful if you want to have the same controls on multiple places. Maybe you want to have the idea of a user, an address edited, right? So it's going to have different components to go together, make an address, like the street and state, name, whatever you want to put in there. And so you can have all that there, all the code to validate it, and then reuse that in multiple places. But the other places shows up useful is that you can have the frames put together in different ways for different layouts. So for example, you can use a tab control for a form or side by side for a tablet. But an even more flexible option is the MultiView. MultiView is fairly recent. MultiView is one super panel, multiple modes. So it has different modes you see here, and there's examples over there on the right. The platform default mode, though, when you choose that one, it looks at the screen size and orientation and then chooses the mode that fits best for that. You can also use the custom mode to create your own user-defined layout and behavior. So very, very powerful, very flexible. I love the drawer layout and the new navigation panel, which is the one you see on the top or to the lower right-hand side there, that expands to be like a full drawer and then collapses to just being like a toolbar down the left or right-hand side. Very powerful, very flexible. Really need to take advantage of this in your application development. For more information, here are all the learning resources, all the links you've seen along here, along with a couple Code Rage video replays by Serena DuPont. She does a great job showing how to use some of these. She comes at it from a more design point of view, which is great. I come at it from a more technical, how do you do this point of view? So go there to get a better understanding of how to put all these pieces together and make a really awesome user interface. The most important link, though, is the one you've seen down at the bottom all the way through, is sprint-fmx-layouts. And that links to all of these here as well. So tune in next Tuesday, for developing IDE plugins for RAD Studio. This is going to be a great one. Quick introduction to developing IDE plugins. It'll be Tuesday, the 26th of December, and this one's only be available in Object Pascal because of the proximity to Christmas holiday. These special offers are only available for a limited time, so act fast. All registered users of previous versions qualify for upgrade pricing when upgrading to RAD Studio, Delphi, or C++ Builder 10 Seattle. That is a savings of up to 45% off the new user price. Additionally, all 10 Seattle registered users get the bonus pack, which includes the new book by Marco Cantu, the Object Pascal Handbook. This essential reference is a modern language guide that includes new features of the language and the core runtime library, a must-have for any Delphi developer. Also get the MITRE Converter Basic. It handles the heavy lifting when converting existing VCL applications into FireMonkey applications, so you can start to take advantage of multi-device development. And the Premium Style Pack includes premium styles for VCL and FireMonkey to make your application look great on every platform. If you buy or upgrade to Professional, Enterprise, or Ultimate, you get Kanopka Signature VCL controls and CodeSight Studio 5 for free. This collection of components and debugging tools will rocket your apps to new heights. And if you upgrade to Architect, you get the entire RAD Studio Solution Pack for free. This gives you every component and tool you need to make your applications great. For more information on these offers and more, visit Embarcadero.com/radoffer and act fast before time runs out. Okay, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for joining us, and now we will do our live Q&A. So if there's any questions, go ahead and put them in the question panel and go to Webinar Software. There's already a few in here I've been answering as we go along, and I'll do my best to answer any more you might have. First one, guy's asking if says this looks a lot of the same functionality you find in WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation. I'm just curious if it's based on WPF and how it compares performance-wise. So FireMonkey is its own engine, which gives you the advantage of it working the same across all platforms. So you can, WPF works great on Windows, FireMonkey works great on Windows, OS X, iOS, and Android. Performance-wise, WPF is based on DirectX. FireMonkey uses DirectX on Windows and then OpenGL on the other platforms. So general performance is always hard to measure because you can, generally speaking, find corner cases that are faster either way. But for the most part, FireMonkey is very fast, and it's just as fast as WPF. Like I said, there may be instances where it is way faster or way slower for certain things, but for the most part, for everything I've seen, it is very fast and fast enough for general application development purposes. Let's see. So the question here says, when developing an app for Android or iOS, should I only use one main form with all the controls on it, or should I divide it into several forms? So it depends. If you have a lot of control, so the reason, what happens if you only have one form is everything gets instantiated at once. But if you have multiple forms or multiple frames, you can create and destroy those frames or forms only as you need them. So what that allows you to do, well, you create them, and if you stop referencing them, then the automatic garbage counting releases the memory form. So what that means is, let's say you have tab control that has 30 tabs on it, and each tab's got a number of controls on it. If you do that all in one form, then what happens is when the user comes in to use the application, it takes a while because it has to go through and instantiate all those controls, and all the constructors get called, and all the setup gets called, and if it's connecting to databases and pulling data out and displaying data in those controls, that all gets called. And so the advantage of that, it could be that once the app instantiates, then they're able to move through everything very quickly, and there's never a time it has to go out and do any setup again. Now, if instead you use frames, for example, and put all the controls from each tab in a separate frame, and then only when the user switches to that tab, you instantiate the frame and place it on the tab, then what you do is you spread out all those constructor calls over multiple times. So if they never go to tabs 25 through 30, you don't ever have to construct those, for example. So you could end up saving some time. And plus, users tend to be more sensitive to a lot of time all at once instead to short amounts of wait over a longer period of time. So it's a matter of showing your user different behavior that's more acceptable to them. So, and you can also do other things like you could create those frames in the background, etc. Now, you could use multiple forms instead, and then just switch between forms. There's lots of options, but it generally comes down to the different, which way to go is determined by how big your application is, how many controls you're going to have on there, and such. So hopefully that answers your question. So he's asking which fonts to use. It depends on the platform, and I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Segoe, Segoui, is the recommended font for Windows. I've never seen any delay with that one, or any delay at all. I'm curious exactly what's going on for you, but yeah, that's the one you want to use on Windows. And then on Android, the font you want to use is called Robotics, which is Robot, something like that. It's the default one that gets selected automatically by the styles for those platforms, so you don't have to mess with that. You can use custom fonts on Android and iOS, but by default you shouldn't. And what is the new one? It's Apple just rolled out a new one for iOS, and I can't remember what it's called. It's similar to Helvetica, but it's called something different. It's got it's the name after a place in California. I want to say Mavericks, but that was the name of the old OS 10. Anyway, maybe it's called California or San Francisco. San Francisco, that's where it is. Yeah, I haven't seen the slowdown you're talking about, though. Are frames instantiated once when first used, or each time they're used? So they're instantiated each time they're used, and that way, if you have, let's say you create a frame for editing a name, okay, and which is a really simple frame, but it had a box, and then it has a button, and it has a label or has a few edit boxes, a button, and a label. Now, let's say you want to edit multiple names in a family. Okay, so you have the mom, the dad, and the kids. So you instantiate, we'll say, 8 instances of that frame or 6 instances of that frame, whatever you think you need to have. Now, if you only had one instance of that frame, then when you edit the first one, it would edit all the text in the other ones as well, because those edit boxes only existed once, and so they can only contain one value. But if instead it instantiated multiple instances, different instances, then you could have each one could have a different value in it. So yeah, it instantiates each one's a different value. Now, in your application though, the program code, there's the program code versus the data code. There's only one instance of the program code, but then the data is separated out. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, saying with iOS. So yeah, on iOS you'd want to use the San Francisco font, and I haven't seen the slowdown you're talking about. So I would suggest posting on community with some details about what's going on for your slowdown, and hopefully you can get an answer there. And if you don't, email me with the link to the post on community. I'll take a look at it. So here's says not related to this skill sprint, but a question about performance profilers. So AQ Time by SmartBear is a great performance profiler for different platforms, VCL applications on different platforms for Windows. For iOS and Android, you can use the platforms. The platform development tools for each platform comes with a performance profiler provided by the platform vendor that you can use with those. So, and I've used those with FireMonkey applications as well, so you can use that. One thing I realized after the fact I didn't mention is there's a great library called the T-Frame Stand, which there's a link to the Code Rage video on the URL there for the blog notes. And I did include that on this resource refresher slide. Check that out. It's really, really powerful library, third-party library. It's available through Git. That's you can use to instantiate frames. Very, very cool what you can do with it. There's a whole Code Rage session showing how to use it. So more than we could have covered in the skill sprint today.
And I wanted to mention on the vertical scroll box is used quite a bit when you want to put controls on a form and have them fit on a device where you can scroll up and down.
Yes.
Got a form that's a little bigger or more real estate. And there's samples. There's a sample that shows how to use the vertical scroll box for forms of that kind, where you're doing input and then you get those little helper buttons that take you to the next field, and so on.
Yep. Actually, I had I was meeting with a customer that was wanting to build an app that it was interesting. It had like 3 separate scrollable areas, and inside those scrollable areas were scrollable areas. Or no, it was one. Okay, that's right. It was you could scroll the whole form up and down, and then it had columns within there, and then some of those columns, parts of those columns were independently scrollable as well. And so I built a little quick mock-up with him that was a large vertical scroll box with all the controls in it, and then some of those controls were list views. And so you could scroll within the list view or scroll the whole vertical scroll box. And it was, he's like, oh wow, that's exactly what I wanted to do. So it's really powerful. And something I wanted to do in this skill print but didn't get around to is showing how when you nest some of these different layouts within each other, some of the things you can accomplish with that. And so that gets a lot more powerful when you do a little bit of nesting on these, and you're able to do more. And one thing that's cool about FireMonkey is actually anything can be nested. So like you saw, I had my buttons nested in my flow break, but you can nest anything, and that's very, very powerful.
And going back to one of the questions about how many controls on a form, or maybe iOS and Android, with the new form designer where you can create custom views for different form factors, especially for mobile devices and tablets and so on. You have more control on how you might do layouts for a 5-inch form factor versus a 7-inch versus a 10-inch or whatever. So check out the the master view and then the device views that you can create as well.
Yep. Oh yeah, that's great. Fire UI. There's a Fire UI skills. The code range covers that, so check that out for sure. Okay, I think we're done. So thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully this is useful for you. These layouts in FireMonkey are so powerful, and if you come from a VCL background, you may not be familiar with some of the flexibility and nuances that are available here. So hopefully this is enough to get you started. You can do some experimenting and unlock the power of FireMonkey layouts to really create some very dynamic user interfaces in your application development. So thank you so much. There's a question here from Jens asking, says the scale layout is like bitmap scaling. Does do the components themselves get bigger, or does it just scale up the images? So it actually does scale up the components, so the font will remain sharp. You can test this. Just make a really small form with a scaled layout on it that is set to fit, and then blow it up really big, and you'll see that the font doesn't get jagged at all. It still remains nice and sharp. Now, the components, because they're based on bitmap themes, styles, they grow, but there are only certain resolutions that they'll look sharp in because of the way they work. So they don't get, at least when I've looked at them, they still look fairly nice, but you can tell that they are enlarged images. They're not vector drawn at the larger resolutions. So text looks great, components look okay. Okay. Sergio is asking if using lots of layout components on a form may affect app performance. I guess it depends on how you define lots. Yeah, it depends on it. I would, at some point, there probably is a point where you could use too many, but generally speaking, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. It depends on what you're doing. If you're trying to fill, a 1920 by 1080 resolution window with scroll boxes and components and stuff like that, you probably will experience slowdown. Although I don't know that the layouts will be the slowdown issue, but just the number of components you'll be piling on top of those layouts. So one thing that's important to note is it is rendering all this on the hardware on the computer, or the video acceleration hardware, DirectX on Windows or OpenGL on other platforms. So it is hardware accelerated, so it shouldn't have too big of an impact. I mean, if you consider how many polygons games push out, this is going to be a drop in the bucket by comparison.
Yeah, there's been improvements over time in FireMonkey. Used to be we were moving bitmaps, for example, when you're doing animation effects and so on. We were moving them from CPU memory to GPU memory. But I forget which version, several versions ago, we started just pushing the bitmaps right into the GPU right away so that they get massaged, animated, updated, and so on in the GPU memory and go right to the screen versus having to go back and forth. It's only if you want to get something, let's say get the contents of the canvas that of a current form or a part of a form, that it has to pull it out of GPU memory. You can use the old tricks of creating, if you're creating forms on the fly, create them off page and then show them when it's ready. There are also methods, begin update, end update, when you're populating lists and so on, versus just putting objects in one at a time. And so you can have a lot of that enhancement for speed, so that you'll have crisp performance. And then after that, the users, you're waiting for human input, right? You could also use parallel programming, and there's ways to synchronize objects and screens and so on, component contents, so that you can be doing more things in separate threads. So check out the parallel programming sessions from Code Rage, for example. Danny Wind does a great job on responsive user interface in the Delphi track. So check that out, both from Code Rage 9 and Code Rage 10 he did even more of that stuff. So there's another question, Jim.
Yeah, so Jens is asking which layout to use for layout styles. It really depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish. My goal here was to show you the way these different layouts behave. I mean, there's the regular layout and there's 3D layout, which I didn't get into. Regular layout is just going to be just like a panel from VCL. It doesn't do anything special. It's just a container to put things in. But all the other layouts have different behaviors, and so I've showed you how those work today. And so then you can, when you think about your user interface you're designing and how you want it to behave, what you want to accomplish, you can now see which layout you want to use. And so if you want to have a layout where it's always the exact same components in the same position, they just get bigger or smaller on different size screens, that would be a scale layout. If you want to have a layout where if it's on a larger screen, then maybe the toolbar goes into one line, and if it's on a smaller screen, the toolbar goes into, or the collection of components goes into two different lines, and then it has like a memo beneath it that fills the rest of the space. That would be a flow control or flow layout. So really you need to consider what it is you're trying to accomplish, what is your vision for the way your app's going to be laid out, and then you can use these controls. Now, if you're only wanting to have exactly the same sort of behavior you had in VCL, where everything's moved around manually, then you just use a regular layout, and none of this new behavior comes into play. So it really depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish and your objectives in that. So Sergio's saying, if I put a T grid panel layout on a form with, for example, 4 rows and 2 columns, and on each panel I add another T layout with some components on it, does this affect UI performance? So the answer to the question is yes, but the reality is it's going to be affecting it outside the realm of user perception for the most part. Anything you do requires computation. Now, is that computation going to have an impact on the user's experience? Probably not. Now, if you have, there's a threshold where you're going to pass that, it's going to have an impact on user perception of the application. Where that's at, it's going to depend on hardware and a number of other things, like David was saying, the way you're programming things, if you're instantiating all your forms at once, stuff like that. So if you break apart your user interface into different frames and then instantiate those frames only as you need them, or maybe instantiate them in the background, you're going to really reduce the impact on users' perception on startup time for your application. So, so my answer would be test it and then look at other ways of optimizing performance if it does become an issue. Most likely, that scenario you described is not going to have any noticeable impact on a user. You could probably have quite a few. I mean, you saw how many buttons I had on there, like 30 buttons, something like that. It was still sliding just fine. There was a little bit of lag, but that was because of the video recording. Whenever I test these beforehand, they're always much faster. But then as soon as I start recording the video, it gets a little slower because of the video recording. But yeah, they slide nicely. There's no, I haven't seen any noticeable slowdown in my UI testing. A long time ago, I actually did some experiments with VCL just to see how many panels I could stack, and I think I stacked like 500 of them and didn't have any problem at all. Because yeah, anyway, the reality is most of the time they're not going to have the impact is going to be non-noticeable. Okay, so as far as the align, Jens is saying that the components are fine, but he wasn't sure about the different align properties. Really, it comes down to you can use the ones like you used in VCL. All those are still there, left, right, client, top, bottom. Those are there, but then it's like, oh, I want to be centered in the client, but I want it to maintain aspect ratio. Well, that would be fit. Okay. Oh, I want to be on the left, but I want to make sure I'm always on the left, even more so left than something else that's on the left. Well, that would be most left. Okay. So when you look at that, I'm going to put all the explanation I put in there of those layouts, and then when you are looking at that, it's like, oh, I want left, but I want more so left. Well, okay, that's most left, right? So you can see what the differences are between those different layouts, and then you know which one you want to use just by elimination based on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So yeah, at first I was in that same boat actually, where I'm like, I don't know what all these mean, and then I was doing something. I was like, I want this to behave this way. I was like, oh yeah, there's one I can do that now. And there's times before when I would write code where I was like, okay, well, I won't use an alignment. I'll just write code that says when the parent resizes, then I'll do this or do that or whatever. And now there's an alignment that does that. So really, whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, look at the alignments and look at the explanations of them, and most likely there will be an alignment that does what it is you're trying to accomplish. Saying thanks for the time, still new to FireMonkey, but layouts and alignments seem like FireMonkey made a huge step forward compared to VCL. Yeah, I agree that I was a little slow to pick up FireMonkey at first as well, but as I did, I'm like, oh, now everything I do is in FireMonkey because there's so much more options and so much more flexibility for what you can do. And then plus you have the added benefit where it's like, oh, I want to run this on Mac, I want to run this on Android, I want to run this on iOS, and now all of a sudden my little utility apps or whatever it happens to be are cross-platform, multi-device applications. So very cool, very, very nice, huge step forward, I agree.
And in the VCL, we're really sitting, we've done extensions, but we're sitting over the Windows API, right? What the Windows API gives us for doing standard UI types of activities. Once we're in the GPU world with DirectX, with OpenGL, OpenGLES, we have a world of options to do, as well as with FireMonkey, we're adding over time support for native controls under the covers, right? On Android, on iOS, and so on. So there's always some people who want to just have it be exact the native controls, and there's others that want to control the look and feel of the styles. So the team is continuing to do that work, adding support for native on iOS, for example, for edit box, for memo. It lets you do the typing completion and fixing and all of those kinds of things. You get those in a sense for free. So there's always going to be more work to go on how you can use some of the native controls on a platform versus the FireMonkey styled controls.
And one thing actually is that 10 Seattle actually did get a number of new VCL controls as well, especially it's got a whole new layout, relative layout. That's so cool. It's a VCL only layout, but there's a number of new controls, new layouts, or new controls, VCL controls in 10 Seattle as well. That actually I was doing this like, I can talk about that. I was like, oh wait, no, I'm talking about FireMonkey.
Yeah.
So I didn't have time anyway, but yeah, there's a lot of improvements in Seattle on the VCL side as well. So that was great to see as well.
Yeah, check out Serena's Code Rage 10 session. Definitely look at MultiView versus just putting panels here or there, or tab controls, or splitting up parts of your UI. MultiView is a great container to be used across both phone form factors, tablet form factors, and desktop. It works for all.
Yep, and I believe that there was a skill I should go look on Fire UI that covered the MultiView. So I'll go dig that one up and include that in links as well.
Okay.
Just because that's such a useful, I agree, such a useful layout.
Yep.
Can you just go back over VCL and whatever it will be in the future, pushing FireMonkey as a priority? Let's see.
No, VCL is never going to be retired. VCL, as long as there's a Windows API, VCL will always be around and will always take whatever new UI elements that are available in Windows. So it will always be around. If Windows goes away, well, and the Windows API goes away, then maybe there's no time for VCL in the future.
And we saw that
FireMonkey's for multi-platform.
Yep, and we saw that commitment to the VCL with 10 Seattle, with all the new controls that went into that, and the improvements and making it fit really nicely on Windows 10. So, yeah, VCL is going to be around as long as there's a Windows API to run it on. There's one question here. How do you convert from the coordinates of contained objects from absolute coordinates to scaled coordinates? So there is a local to absolute method that you can call on the layout that will convert the local coordinates to the absolute coordinates on the form, but I just tested. It does not take into account the scaling, so it's actually just testing this here to see if I can come up with a solution. I'll probably have to answer this later, and I'll add it to the blog post there. But yeah, I don't have the. I thought the local absolute would handle that, but apparently it doesn't handle the scaling automatically. But there's probably a there's a scale. Yeah, I'll have to mess with this later. There's another variable that you're gonna have to do a little math with really quickly to do that conversion. But it would be cool to have a tessellate layout for geometric shapes, for example, hexagons. That would be cool. Sure, that would be cool. I can't think of anything I've seen that does that already, though. Also frequently asked about the performance impact of using layouts, nesting layouts, and that's something that really gets powerful is when you start nesting these layouts, which I kind of showed the example of in the grid layout where I had the regular layout nested in the grid layout. Anything you do, the more you do, will have slight performance impact, but the reality is typically you're not going to see any measurable, noticeable impact to the user within reason. Now, if you are constructing lots and lots and lots of controls right away when your application starts up, then you'll have an impact there. But if you want to, if you can delay part of it by using frames, for example, and if you have a tab control, instead of constructing every sheet of tab control, only constructing the ones the user can see at first, then that will improve the construction time. Lots of great stuff, so much more flexibility and power in the FireMonkey layout. So hopefully this was good information to get everybody started so you can go in there and start experimenting with these layouts and figure out how to use them in your applications to really make dynamic user interfaces that will look good across all platforms. And you know, what you've seen before, the way you can do the multi-device preview, so you can preview it on different forms, different layouts, different form factors, etc. So very cool, very powerful to really create that one form to rule them all, if you will. Okay, well I think that's it for questions. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you all next week.